Okay, welcome everybody to CSIS. My name is Moises Rendon. I'm the director of the Future of Venezuela Initiative and fellow of the Americas program. This is our first virtual event. We'll be posting a complete video in our website after the event finish. We will also post a transcript in Spanish. Our featured and only speaker today is Elliott Abrams. He's the U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela. Mr. Abrams has a long and respected history as a diplomat and public servant here in the Washington, D.C. We're very thankful for having him to join us for our very first virtual event in this unprecedented moment in the U.S. and the world history. Thank you, Mr. Abrams.
You're very welcome. I didn't know doing an experiment here with the virtual event. We were going to do this before the pandemic struck as a normal event. I'm glad we're still able to do it.
That's correct. This is better than nothing. Despite the global shutdown due to COVID-19, the U.S. government has continued to work hard and introduce new tools to pressure the Maduro regime, right? And this is why we're putting in this conversation together. In February, for example, sanctions were imposed on Russian oil company Rosneft, and then further sanctions were expanded to its subsidiaries in March. On March 26th, the DOJ, the Department of Justice of the United States, unveiled major indictments, including narcoterrorism, trafficking, money laundering, and other charges against Maduro and more than a dozen regime officials, right? And this is also was an important event that just happened recently. 5 days after indictments were announced, the U.S. State Department proposed a democratic transition framework for Venezuela, which outlines concrete steps for recovery for Venezuela. And within this context, Mr. Abrams, I know there's a lot of events that just happened, and there's a lot of questions and a lot of things that we can cover today. We're going to give you a few minutes for introductory remarks. I'm going to follow with one or two questions, and then we're going to open it up from our audience. And that I know they are already sending questions. And so thank you, Mr. Abrams. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. What you said is exactly right. We're continuing with our Venezuela policy. So the activities of the regime certainly have not stopped because of the pandemic. In the last couple of weeks, for example, there have been a whole series of arrests of people around Juan Guaido. They haven't arrested him, but they have arrested many members of his team and are treating some of them quite brutally. So we thought we're going to continue with this policy. And we were asked last year, and of course this year, well, what's the way forward, though? In addition to the pressure, how do you get out of this? How are sanctions lifted? And we thought, that's quite a legitimate question, and we ought to answer it. So we began to develop this proposal, and it is a proposal, for a way to transition from the Maduro regime to democracy, and ultimately to a presidential election, because an election is what they need to have a fully legitimate government. So that counts. Just a word about the indictments that I think people in many other countries don't recognize. The State Department doesn't have anything to do with indictments. At a certain point, March, I guess, the Attorney General came over and said to us, grand juries have returned indictments on the following people, and that will be announced in a few weeks. And these are activities that have been taking place over a period of years, primarily drug trafficking, though in a few cases, money laundering and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, in other words, bribery. We also announced the military exercises, which are aimed at stopping narcotics trafficking, because again, while so much normal activity has stopped everywhere, criminal activity has not stopped. Drug traffickers are still trying to traffic drugs. So we moved ahead with that effort to stop. Our hope is that lots of people in Venezuela in the Chavista party, the PSUV, in the army, inside the government, will look at the proposal and maybe say, well, Maduro has to leave power, but we are treated reasonably. The future of the military as an institution is thought about in this plan. The future of the PSUV party, that is the right to compete in elections fairly, is thought about in this plan. So our hope is that it actually produces some kind of discussion within various parts of the society, not only the opposition. Why don't I stop with that?
Yeah, sounds good. That's a good start on the first point. I believe that this new framework can convince Maduro and the Maduro regime for his exit, right, and to agree to it. And let me do a second on top of that, which is we're also talking about criminal criminal enterprise, right? The Maduro regime is involved, as the DOJ and many of you and us have put out, that this is a criminal enterprise that is using institutions of the state from these governments.
Well, you're absolutely right that it is reminiscent of what was proposed by the opposition in Barbados last. It was. They talked about a counter state, for example, which about. The difference, I think, is that the pressures on the regime are complete. Part of the oil prices. The collapse of oil prices coming from the Saudi-Russian oil price war. So supply has increased at exactly the moment that demand due to coronavirus has collapsed. So think of the finances of the regime and their ability to, Maduro has admitted publicly that the price they're getting for crude oil is below the cost of production. Production is declining, more and more is in storage. Buyers, partly due to U.S. sanctions, buyers are reluctant to buy. You even saw this kind of interesting thing with Rosneft, where the Russian government seems to have bailed out Rosneft and said, yes, you can get out of Venezuela, which is certainly not a vote of confidence by Rosneft in the oil sector in Venezuela. So the thought is maybe people in the regime recognize what they didn't recognize last summer, which is that the situation is increasingly difficult, not going to get better, and they need to look for a way out. They need to look for negotiated, agreed way forward. Now, one can argue that it's harder because of the indictments, because people who are indicted now, they have no place else to go. They have one place to go, which is Venezuela, because the Venezuelan constitution does not permit extradition. So if they stayed in Venezuela, I guess they'd be beyond the ability of the United States to get them if they went to Cuba, with which obviously we also have no extradition treaty. But it is our hope that those indictments, again, which were not they're not a matter of foreign policy. They came from U.S. attorneys and grand juries in New York City and in Miami. Maybe they make the regime even more toxic, and maybe they persuade more people in Venezuela and out, look, this regime has to go. They've got to start moving toward a free election and electing a president legitimately.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So another question relating to the risk, right? Like, what if Maduro doesn't accept this agreement? What we have seen in the last few months and years, Mr. Abrams, that as much as pressure that we put on Maduro, the more they move towards criminal activities, right? And we see illegal mining, for example, has rise, narco trafficking has also come up, and in a way, Maduro is more independent on criminal dependency to criminal to criminal activities in Venezuela. So uh, is this a risk that you have in mind in terms of if they don't accept or don't agree on this path forward, and if so, what would be the steps that we need to take into consideration, right? Given the criminal nature of this regime.
It's they have the oil income has been reduced. It's not primarily because of U.S. sanctions. Right now, we know why. It's because of the collapse of oil prices.
Yeah.
But production levels were going down. Once upon a time, Venezuela was producing over 3 million barrels a day. It came down to 1 million. Last year, it came down to maybe 750,000. Now it's lower than that. The main reason is, they haven't put any money into the oil sector. So things are getting more and more offline. They're getting more and more decrepit. So yes, they have been relying more over the last few years on criminal activities, gold mining, yarco minero, and drugs, traffic, drugs from Colombia going into Venezuela and then north. They've also relied on gold, which you might call semi-legitimate gold sales, by which I mean the sale of monetary gold from the central bank. The gold from the gold fields never hits the central bank. It's simply smuggled out and sold to somebody in Turkey or someplace. The gold from the central bank, those are, that's gold bars. Last year they sold something like $800 million or $1 billion worth. By the way, it disappeared. Nobody knows where it went. But so that's money for the regime. In our view, they're going to do what they can to get money anywhere they can. They have been for years. In the earlier years, they had enough money from oil revenues, and they just stole a lot of it. Now there's a lot less money from oil revenues, and we think, they'll try to continue on and on. But there are beginning to be signs, I think, that people in and around the regime realize there's no way out here. There's just a path down, and they've got to figure out some way forward. Now, we proposed one path forward. Maybe there are others. We don't really see them, but what you need is what you didn't have last year in Barbados. Last year in Barbados, the opposition proposed the National Assembly team representing Guaido proposed this Council of State idea. And there were a lot of things that were discussed in Barbados, but one thing could not be discussed: Maduro, the future of Maduro. The regime negotiators said, no, that's not on the table. And I think when they look at the pressures now, they've got to start coming to realization, more and more of them. Maybe not Maduro, maybe he's the last, but more and more of them around him. He's the obstacle. He's got to go.
Yeah, but he can also still run for president once there is a potential presidential election in Venezuela. Is that correct? The same with Guaido, no? So that's creating a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Our view was, look, we're not Venezuelans. We're putting forward a proposal. We didn't think it was right for foreigners to say, okay, here's a list of Venezuelans who can run for office, and here's a list of Venezuelans who cannot run for office. We just thought that was inappropriate for a government to do. We made one exception to that, which was not about a person, it was about a position. We said, look, it's a fragile political system trying to return to democracy under our plan. Whoever is under the Council of State or is a member of the Council of State, the transitional president, shouldn't run for president because people won't believe that he or she isn't going to, try to tilt the election for his or her own victory. In the case of Maduro, look, he's the most toxic figure in Venezuela. Some people in the opposition have said to me they hope he runs because he'll be the easiest Chavista to beat. And as Secretary Pompeo said, he's done. He's never going to rule Venezuela again. If he presents himself in an election, he's going to be crushed.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Abrams, the framework also proposes free and fair elections as the way out. No, in Venezuela, there, many people are skeptical to find an electoral way out in Venezuela, given the precedents, right, that the Maduro regime has always stolen elections in Venezuela in the past few years. Conditions are not there, not even close. Colectivos and paramilitary groups represent a threat to the voters and to the Venezuelan people. The media and the medias that are left in Venezuela are repressed and are limited. So there is no way that any opposition candidates can have room to run their campaigns in a democratic country. That said, I think the framework states that, Venezuela will have about 6 to 12 months to work on these conditions. But what specifically can international do that there is free and fair elections in an environment that, as you said, is so toxic, there's so many criminal activities, and there's so much to do, right?
Yes. Yeah, sure. And we did say in the framework that our sanctions would finally be lifted, be revoked, when there's a consensus of international observers that the elections were, in fact, fair and free. You couldn't have an election tomorrow, and in our view, you couldn't have a free election under Nicolas Maduro. We saw this in 2018 in the unfair election that led Venezuela really into the present political crisis, because the international observers could not certify that that was a fair election. Now, could you take I think we said 9 to 12 months, but take a year. Could you get there in a year? We think the answer to that is yes, because if you remove censorship, you'd get the development of a free press very, very quickly. You'd get people all over the internet. You'd get TV and radio stations springing up again, or ones that exist starting to operate without government control. You would need that time to figure out technically how to do the elections and to figure out a system that would allow the millions of Venezuelans who are now abroad to vote in Quito or Guayaquil, or to vote in Bogota. So you would need time. But this is one thing the international community is actually quite good at, helping not only observe elections, but helping operate elections. You have organizations like the Carter Center and IFES, and in this country, NDI and IRI, and you've got the EU has done this many, many times. At this point, over the last couple of decades, hundreds of times. So I would say all of these organizations know how to help prepare for an election and monitor an election, and not just on election day. Monitoring is now a multi-month process so that you make sure that access is open and the press is free. And could you do this? Thinking of the pandemic, could you do this now in the summer? Clearly not. But could you do it in 9 months or 12 months? I think with the kind of help that will be available, I think the answer is yes.
Okay. Before moving on to the question from the audience, I already have about 5 questions with me here. I want to ask about the pandemic, the COVID-19, and the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. I understand there is not a long-term solution. There's not a long-term solution to the humanitarian crisis without Venezuela recovering its democracy, its liberty, and its freedoms, right? That I completely agree. But nonetheless, the people are suffering. There are food and medicine shortages, and the fact that COVID-19 is spreading in a speed that we don't even know. The Maduro regime official numbers are only above 150 cases of coronavirus, but I assume there are many more. So what can we do to limit the suffering while we work on the political and democratic side, right? I don't think they can be in parallel. So what can we do to ensure and help the Venezuelan people from a humanitarian point of view?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think the notion of 150 cases in Venezuela is at all credible, and given the terrible condition of the medical system, one really has to be fearful of the spread of the disease. Yesterday, or I think it was yesterday, maybe today, a plane arrived, organized largely by PAHO and UNICEF, I believe, with 90 tons of medical equipment. How did they get that past the U.S. sanctions? Well, the answer, of course, is sanctions never cover food, medicine, medical equipment. So anybody who wants to do that can do it. So can the regime. We know that last year the regime was buying food in the United States. They can buy, if they want to buy antibiotics, they want whatever is available. They can buy. And we've been saying for years since the heavier sanctions were imposed, if there is overcompliance, we said to the regime, if there's overcompliance, let's say you're trying to buy, I don't know, last year, pacemakers, and the bank or the company says, no, there are sanctions, we don't want to deal with it, just tell us, tell Treasury. And Treasury will contact the company or the bank and say, do it, you're covered, it's fine. In this, whatever it is now, 14 months, not one case. That is, the regime has not come to us a single time. We're in the middle of investigating a recent effort to break sanctions by buying several dozen police cars, SUVs, to serve as police cars in the United States now, this year. So it's very interesting. The regime figures out ways to buy police cars, but it doesn't want to use that kind of money, millions of dollars, to buy. Now, the U.S. Congress has appropriated lots of money. We're now up to 60. And what we do is that AID is in charge of this. They give the money to, UNICEF, PAHO, the ICRC. They've just appropriated $300 million more. That's globally, but a share of that will be used by AID, again, to give to the same agencies because they're on the ground in Venezuela. I think that's the best way to help. And they know, these UN agencies and UNICEF and all, they know that U.S. sanctions have nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
Anything they can buy, they can get in.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's time to go for some questions, Mr. Abrams. I'm trying to compile the questions into the themes that we have here. I think that the most important, the ones that were receiving the most questions is about this concept of mafia state, right? And proposing a deal to a mafia state can generate a lot of confusion. So I assume that there's a lot of questions that are coming on this side. We have one from Diego Arria. He's a former Venezuelan ambassador to the UN, former presidential candidate. He's asking the following: why would the U.S. ask Venezuela to coexist with narco-terrorists defined by you? Such an arrangement would be unthinkable in the U.S. I have another question on the same line from Pedro Burelli, former member of the executive board of PDVSA, among other things. He's saying, could you explain the logic of guarantees for the current senior command of the military, and in particularly for the indicted Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez? And in the same direction, why do you insist that Maduro could run in the future election when others in the U.S. government are insisting he must go, and the U.S. plays a $50 million tag on his head? I also have a final question on this same line. Daniel Di Martino from Vente, Venezuela. He's saying, why does the democratic transition framework allow the high command of the Venezuelan military to stay in power during a transition? Doesn't that undermine the chance of having any free and fair election while allowing indirect narco-terrorists like Vladimir Padrino to continue to sack Venezuela? So again, they're all related. Yeah, back to you.
Right. Yes, I understand. All good questions. How do we get out of this terrible crisis in Venezuela? Or more to the point, how do Venezuelans get out? Okay, maybe you believe in magic and you think that someone will wave a magic wand That's one way out. Maybe you think the United States is going to invade tomorrow, and the Marines will land, and everything will be just fine. That's another way out. But suppose you don't believe that those are going to happen today or tomorrow. Every dictatorship in Latin America, with the rarest of exceptions, ends with a negotiation. Think back, to all those military dictators of Chile, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Uruguay, Brazil. Every one ends with a negotiation. The exceptions, well, Panama. Okay. So if you want to propose an American invasion, that's fine. Go ahead and propose it. But if that's not going to happen, then how does this come to an end? And our view is it comes to an end the way it came to an end in most of Latin America. For that matter, the way South Africa's dictatorship came to an end, through a negotiation. Now, you don't exactly get to choose who you negotiated with. You end up negotiating with the people who were there. Let's be realistic. We could say, okay, here's how it ends. The opposition, the majority in the National Assembly, takes over tomorrow morning, and everybody connected to the Chavista Party and the army goes to jail. Is this a realistic proposal? It is not. We tried to make a proposal that we thought was realistic given the situation in Venezuela. Now look, Venezuela has huge security problems. If you assume that there is a political settlement that works, a terrific political settlement, there will still be a huge security problem. Drug traffickers, ELN, FARC, criminal gangs, colectivos. Venezuela is going to need security forces. It's going to need an army. It has long borders. We could have said,